Yeah, welcome to Philoxenia, welcome to Kreisky Forum, everyone. Thank you, Sabine, for being here also now, kicking off the new season. And thank you, Adam Shatz, for coming to us tonight.
Thank you. And thank you, Sabine. Thank you, Tessa, for inviting me.
Adam is at the moment in Vienna for these weeks at the Institut für die Wissenschaft vom Menschen. So we were lucky to be able to snatch you. And the reason why we are here is when I saw this book coming out at the beginning of the year in London, and I had this flash because Frantz Fanon, for me as a young woman in Vienna studying history and politics, it was sort of so influential and so interesting to me. And then you find yourself 40 years, 30 years later, and you think like, what was this all about? What is this man? And then you write, Adam, exactly the book that I felt needed to be written about this icon of the sort of black fight for rights, the colonialist struggle, the anti-colonialist struggle, the idea how to deal with a world where you want to rebel and how to rebel and how it makes sense and how it doesn't make sense. And plus, of course, he's a psychiatrist, and that for all of us in Vienna always has a special also meaning. If a rebel is a psychiatrist, I mean, cannot get better than this. And so I was very glad that I could invite you to come here and talk to us about this. And of course, in all this context that Frantz Fanon became originally famous for, and was revisited when Black Lives Matter sort of hit America, but also Europe a few years back. And then while you were researching this, we ended in a completely new also debate on how a young generation goes and struggles for issues that they think are trenched in injustice and how we deal with this. So that's why we're here to discuss all this. But we want to start with the Rebels Clinic, with the book itself and Frantz Fanon. You, of course, are the editor, the US editor of the London Review of Books, one of the sort of publications that drive intellectual debate in America, in Britain, but influences, of course, also the Central European, the continental European debate already for many, many years. So you are not new to this environment. Of course, you are the environment that these thoughts are being developed about how the beginning of the 21st century deals with this enormous amount of injustice that we still see, if it's in America, if it's in Britain, if it's in Europe, or in the rest of the world. So all this plays into this. But I was thinking, why was it that you started to research this book? What was it that you needed to know more about Frantz Fanon?
Thank you. That's a great question. The proximate cause of my writing this book was that in 2016 I spent many months reading Fanon's unpublished writings, collected by two Fanon scholars, Jean Calfa and Robert Young, called Writings on Alienation and Freedom. I reviewed the original French edition of this book, and it revealed Fanon's practice as a psychiatrist and gave a much more textured and nuanced portrait of Fanon as a man. And I was just fascinated by what I read in this book, which also included two of his youthful plays. A third never survived. And just found myself writing this very long piece about Fanon's life and work, and a friend of mine, a British Indian writer, Pankaj Mishra, rather Indian writer based in London, Pankaj Mishra, who's spoken at this forum.
He was my first guest at Philoxenia 7 years ago, and he was supposed to be here at the end of this month. I hope he had to postpone it, but he will come this fall still.
So Pankaj read the piece and said to me, I think this is a book. And so I began to think about it and wrote a proposal, and that's the short answer to your question. I guess the longer answer is that I had been thinking about Fanon for many years. I became aware of Fanon when I was a teenager because my father had his books, English translations of his books in the original Grove Press editions, and
why was that? What was your father's?
I think the reason is that my father had had an interest in the left and in anti-racist struggles. He'd taken part in anti-Vietnam War demonstrations, civil rights demonstrations, and Fanon had a real aura in the late 1960s. He was a very important figure for the Black Power movement. In a sense, Fanon, who died in the United States in Bethesda, Maryland in December 1961, was resurrected in the United States after his death by the Black Panthers, by Black psychiatrists who were very interested in his clinical writings. This was at a time when he was at risk of being forgotten or even actively suppressed in France. By the late 60s, early 1970s, Fanon was also being forgotten in Algeria, the country that he considered, well, the country that he adopted. I read him in college, and there were aspects of his writings that also very, very much spoke to me personally. It wasn't simply the positions that he adopted. It wasn't simply the drama of his life. The fact that he was a French West Indian who had fought for France in the Second World War and then fought against France, or joined a movement fighting against France during the Algerian War of Decolonization, the Algerian Revolution. It also had to do with certain moments in Fanon's writing. I mean, for example, in Black Skin, White Masks, there's a chapter called The Lived Experience of the Black Man, L'expérience vécue du Noir, which was mistranslated in the original English edition as the fact of blackness. Fanon actually didn't believe there was a fact of blackness. But in this particular chapter, he writes what I call the primordial scene, the primal scene in Fanon's work, and it's this encounter with this little white boy on a train, probably a train going from Paris to Lyon. The white boy is with his mother, and he sees Fanon, and he says to his mother, trembling, "Tiens, maman, un nègre." And Fanon, at that time, as a veteran of the war in his early 20s, thought of himself as a French man of color. He thought of himself, first of all, as a French person. That's how he'd been raised by his parents, who were fierce believers in French republicanism, socialists. He didn't think of himself as black. Blacks, as far as Fanon understood, growing up in Martinique, were Africans. They were the tirailleurs sénégalais, the African riflemen, whom he himself, as a child, was afraid of. And so he has this shattering realization, one, that he's black, not French, in the eyes of this little white boy who is a racial expert. I mean, I use that in quotations. And moreover, that this little white boy has all sorts of associations, that the black man is dangerous, the black man is frightening, the black man might be a cannibal. I read this in my late teens, in French actually, when I was a student at Columbia, And it resonated with an experience that I'd had when I was around 10 years old. And I don't mean to suggest at all a perfect parallel, there is none. But I had had an experience of being at school when a group of kids who I had thought of as friends began to throw change at me and to refer to me as, as a dirty Jew. And at the time, I wasn't even aware of the association of Jews and money. I didn't really know much about the prejudices that were attached to Jews in the eyes of non-Jews. As it happens, Fanon was someone who wrote, a great deal about anti-Semitism and the parallels and also the divergences between anti-Semitism and both anti-black racism and anti-Arab racism. But what Fanon captured, I thought, in that chapter was the visceral sense of being defined by someone who claims to know more about you than you know about yourself. And so it was that combination of the analytic and the visceral that gripped me in Fanon's writings. And it so happens that my own original response to that experience was, in fact, to become violent. I ended up beating up one of my tormentors. And not in school, and not just that. For a time, and this will sort of surprise people who think of me and probably as some sort of self-hating Jew, which I'm not. But at another reaction that I had at that moment was to want to associate myself with a kind of Jewishness that I hadn't been raised with. I grew up in a very assimilated, secular, cosmopolitan home. And then after that experience that I had for, very, very briefly, I wore a necklace with a Jewish symbol. Now, as it happens, Fanon writes in that great chapter, The Lived Experience of the Black Man, of how he was initially tempted to, he says, to wade in the irrational and to embrace the negritude of Leopold Senghor, to see himself as part of an ancient, glorious black civilization, to affirm a certain kind of racialized blackness. What was I doing at that time other than to assert some notion of Jewishness and also to become, very violent? So, these were reactions that Fanon had anatomized in his own writing. So I felt a pull towards his work, and then, of course, as I reported from the Middle East, as I wrote about the first and second, the second Intifada in particular, as I traveled to Algeria, I found myself coming up against Fanon, different incarnations, different iterations of Fanon, because after all, Fanon isn't really one thing. There's so much. He lived a very short life, but there's a richness to the work, and so many of the experiences that I had as a reporter brought me back to him. And so he was in my head for a long time, and then so when I finally ended up reporting the book or researching the book, I had actually been thinking about him for a long time, and in fact, I had already done some interviews for the book without even knowing it. In 2000, 2001, while I was writing about the memory of torture in Algeria, I interviewed people who knew Fanon. Mohammed Harbi, a great Algerian historian who is based in France now, who was with the FLN, who knew Fanon in Tunis, and Alice Cherki, who was his intern at Blida, a psychiatrist, now a psychoanalyst. I had interviewed them, and I had interviewed them about Fanon without the faintest idea that eventually I would be writing this book. So it wasn't destiny, but clearly I was drawn to the subject.
Yeah. I don't know if we believe in destiny. Don't know if we believe in destiny, but you clearly could trace back your relationship to some of the subject that drove also Frantz Fanon. What I find incredible about his very, as you say, short life, that there are so many twists in it. And of course, this initial disaster to realize that he goes as a French person to fight for the French, for the free French army forces to liberate or to fight the Nazis And then at the victory party, the women don't want to dance with him because he's black, and he realizes he doesn't count the same as a white French person.
I think it's an interest. It's obviously it was an experience that he found deeply disconcerting, and for good reason. I suspect that he would have had a very different experience if he'd been Black American. I think he probably would have been accepted. I think he would have found dance partners without difficulty. But he was Martinican in French, and that was different.
Yeah. So to realize the racism within the French society.
Oh yeah. I mean,
must have been very...
I think he started to come to grips with it, or at least to notice it when he was in a training camp in Morocco, and he discovered that this army that had been organized to fight, the Nazi Empire, which was of course based on a racial logic, a racist logic, was itself a colonial army, where he was relatively advantaged because, after all, he was West Indian. He wasn't African, and he wasn't Arab. The African riflemen had to wear different uniforms. They ate different food. The Arab soldiers were also treated pretty shabbily. And he felt a sense of confusion when the first people to be sent out to fight were Africans, and he wasn't one of them, and he was confused. Am I an African? Am I West Indian? What ties me to this country? And why am I fighting for this army that claims to be opposing racism in Europe when it's, so flagrantly practicing it within its own ranks?
Well, I mean, it wasn't only the French, of course. You had a certain, if you look at the British society, and when the Windrush scandal came up recently, a few years back, when people realized that not only the people itself who had been brought from the West Indies to Britain to work in the 50s, not only them, they didn't offer papers, documents, passports to nationality, but also their children and their grandchildren, not necessarily. People had scrambled to get their papers, and there were thousands of them once the Guardian researched it, which was really an interesting moment because, this was like 6 years ago when this really blew up.
Right.
And so you think for Frantz Fanon then realizing, okay, so the French he fought for didn't necessarily, had a hierarchy of Frenchnesses. Then to go to Algeria was a big step, but sort of understandable to us because he thought he would fight for the real good struggle.
Not really. No, when he went to Algeria, he had no idea that he would be taking part in a popular movement against colonialism. He went to Algeria because he got a very good job.
Yeah.
He was certainly, he had anti-colonial intuitions and instincts, that's clear. I mean, he was involved in certain kind of anti-colonial activities when he was studying medicine in Lyon. He edited an anti-colonial journal. He moved in left-wing and communist circles. And he also had an experience that I think crucially shaped him as a doctor, which was that he did a lot of work with North African laborers in Lyon. Most of them were Algerian. They were officially known as French Muslims of Algeria. That was their official identity. And he would make these night calls, emergency calls, to workers who were often sleeping 7 or 8 to a room, who were terribly isolated from French society, who were victims of discrimination and racism. And he found that they would complain of physical pains, but could not identify the source. They could not identify a lesion, and French doctors described this as the North African syndrome. For these French doctors, it was a kind of hallucination. These were malades imaginaires, and they were essentially making up excuses because they were either lazy or crazy, and that was how the French medical profession responded to this phenomenon. But Fanon's understanding was that, in fact, they were victims of racism. They were victims of their colonial alienation. They were victims of the fact that they'd been told 1,000 times that they were French when clearly they weren't. And so even before he got to Algeria, he understood something about the French-Algerian relationship and about the psychological effects that it was causing in the colonized. But this was just the best job opportunity that he had, to be the chef de service at the Blida-Joinville Psychiatric Hospital. 11 months into his arrival in Algeria, the FLN, which was an unknown group, an offshoot of a well-known nationalist organization, the MTLD, the FLN launched its armed rebellion. And Fanon didn't hesitate. He knew that he wanted to join immediately. He even wanted to join as a soldier, because after all, he did have experience as a soldier. Fortunately, the FLN found other uses for him, because he could very well have been killed in battle early on.
That would have been a pity for everyone that he treated, because his big thing, of course, was setting up a psychiatric hospital, the first one in North Africa, or the whole continent, maybe.
Well, no. Later, when he was in Tunis, he set up the first day clinic in North Africa. The psychiatric hospital at Blida-Joinville had been there for decades, and it's an interesting fact that the founder of the Blida-Joinville hospital was a psychiatric reformer named Antoine Porot, who was also a pseudoscientific racist, and who hypothesized that Algerians were intellectually inferior, that they were driven by impulses, that they weren't able to reason the way that Europeans could. And so when Fanon got to the hospital, he found himself confronting the depth and pervasiveness of medical racism. Of course, this was something that he knew about in France, and in Algeria, it was even more pervasive.
Difficult. But
that's, I think, like a key point, I think, in this book, is that Fanon was not simply a psychiatrist, he was also a critic of his own profession.
Well, it must have been also really difficult to come out of this whole drama of the Second World War, where racism was such a part of the Nazi ideology, then realizing that it existed to a certain extent in other European nations too, and then sort of reflecting it back on him, and then taking it a step further and saying, okay, so this has to be also expressed in a political struggle, which was the sort of independence of Algeria in his case.
And I think that, Fanon was one of a number of thinkers from what used to be called the Third World, what is, I guess, now called the Global South, who saw that there were genealogical connections between colonial racism and the practices of colonization, the conquests of other societies, and the emergence of Nazism, that these two things actually were connected. Aimé Césaire, of course, most famously made this argument, but you also find echoes of that argument in the writings of W.B. Du Bois, Fanon, and others.
Yeah, but when he sort of understands that he's not only a psychiatrist, but also wants to join the violent struggle, the armed struggle, I found this one quote interesting of Albert Memmi, who says, who is sort of like, as you describe him, as a doppelganger of Fanon, as a Tunisian writer. He says, during the bloodiest days of the Algerian Revolution, he described the choice facing the leftist intellectual as not between good and evil, but between evil and uneasiness. So, of course, if you're a doctor and you join a violent struggle, even if you're really for it, he must have been aware from the beginning that this was not going to be a walk in the park.
Sure, and that was the choice that in the case of Tunisia, Albert Memmi, who was a Tunisian Jewish writer, also very influenced by psychology, that was the choice that he made too, to be uneasy, to support the Tunisian rebels, to edit the newspaper of Habib Bourguiba, who became independent Tunisia's first leader. It was a choice that Fanon made. I'm not really sure that Fanon certainly had moments of uneasiness, and I try to bring those out in the book, but I think that Fanon also had a tremendous capacity to overcome his uneasiness with declamations of certainty. The person who chose evil, was Camus. Camus preferred not to be uneasy in support of an Algerian rebellion. He preferred to support the French army, obviously with caveats and with great expressions of torment and regret, but ultimately he sided with France.
But on the question how Fanon understood, because this is also the what he calls the cleansing power of the anti-colonial violence. Is this the anti-colonial necessarily together with the violence, or can it be just violence? And is that something that, you know, when we read it today, it's really disturbing me, you know, to think of the cleansing power of a violent struggle.
Of course, and I mean, I can understand why it's disturbing. It's my view that while Fanon was certainly a supporter of armed struggle, and that's and I'm very clear on this. I mean, he believed in armed rebellion in the case of Algeria, and I want to say a few words of that because I think that there were very good reasons for him to support armed rebellion. Fanon doesn't actually talk about the cleansing force of violence. He actually talks about disintoxicating. I've faced some criticisms for this, but I still insist on this distinction because while he certainly believed that violence could help to liberate the colonized from feelings of despair, of impotence, of futility, and give them a sense of their own power, their agency. He didn't talk about violence as purifying or redemptive, and he was also very aware of the potential psychological, and of course also physical costs of violence, and he writes about them very vividly and unflinchingly in the extraordinary final chapter of The Wretched of the Earth on colonial warfare and mental disorders. Now, why is Fanon a supporter of armed struggle? I mean, it's important to remember that he was writing about Algeria. Algeria is the model. And Algeria had been violently conquered by France between 1830 and the 1870s, when all resistance was essentially crushed. There had first been a rebellion by the Emir Abdul Khader, then there was a rebellion by Kabyle Berbers led by Mokrani in the early 1870s. In the course of these so-called pacification efforts, about a third of Algeria's population was killed. Some of them were killed by French forces. Others died of illness or starvation. There were the notorious enfumades, where rebels, not just rebels, but ordinary Algerians seeking shelter in caves were asphyxiated by French troops who lit fires outside those caves and literally smoked them out, hence enfumade. So French Algeria was the creation of an extraordinary amount of violence.
Yeah.
you know, and I think people tend to forget that when they talk about the violence of the colonized, they seem to imagine that before the colonized became violent, what you had was peace.
No, of course.
So I mean, and in fact, the Algerians had made many efforts to on behalf of political reform inside of, you know, Algérie française. You know, they had been organized in unions, in peasant organizations, nationalist organizations, and they had fought for inclusion. They had fought for integration of some kind. You had a whole Algerian elite who, you know, spoke fluent French and sought to identify themselves as French, and these efforts had come to naught because of the stubbornness, the brutality, the racism of the Pieds Noirs, of the settler community. And so, you know, the decision to carry out an armed struggle, whether or not it was premature, as some felt, was not taken lightly. You know, it was taken by people who had seen the repeated failure of efforts of peaceful reform. Now, Fanon, of course, was attracted by the idea of armed struggle because, in essence, he was a soldier. He was someone who himself had taken up arms as a young man. He'd gone to France, and he was a man of action, if you will. But his support for armed struggle didn't come out of nowhere. Now, I think it's also important to recognize that while the preface to The Wretched of the Earth by Jean-Paul Sartre is highly incendiary and celebrates the most kind of carnivalesque kind of violence, Fanon's Wretched of the Earth is shot through with warnings about violence. He's not saying don't do it. I mean, you know, he's the but he does say, for example, that while at the beginning of an anti-colonial struggle, any member of the colonizing community is viewed as a legitimate target, eventually the anti-colonial struggle will have to reckon with the fact that there are people on the European side who are going to be more reliable allies than people on our own side, that differences in color or race are not sufficient for understanding people's political identities, and that a politics based on, and I'm paraphrasing, the legitimate desire for revenge, anti-racist racism, and hatred cannot ultimately nourish an anti-colonial struggle. So, and in fact, in his book, Dying Colonialism, he writes about the violent excesses of the FLN and what he calls the almost physiological violence brutality displayed by some rebels. He traces this to colonialism itself, not unreasonably, but it's clear that Fanon is not simply this, you know, this lover of violence. It's I think that's a cartoon.
Well, that would also, we wouldn't sit here if it would be
exactly
like this, because it would be too
But there
stupid.
are people who are determined to characterize him that way.
Yeah, I can imagine. And it's interesting that what you were talking about this now is what he had this speech in 1960 in Ghana, Why We Use Violence. And he was talking exactly about the fact that colonialism is sort of an everyday occurrence, but of course it comes from yesterday and it goes into the future. And it's sort of, it's not a thing that you can throw over easily because it's sort of ingrained in the society also. But it must have been for him in 1960, so he was already, you know, he hadn't long to live anymore, and he was in the middle of this violent struggle where he must have seen how, as in all revolutions, when the blood starts flowing, you have to decide, are you staying with it or are you walking away when your friends, you know, they were betrayed within the FLN, they were killed, and he continued. He did not publicly.
He felt guilty about it.
He must have felt guilty.
He did.
But he didn't walk away.
No, he didn't. I mean, he certainly felt guilty, and he expressed that guilt when he was in Rome meeting with Jean-Paul Sartre and his companion, the philosopher Simone de Beauvoir. He said he personally blamed himself for the deaths of both Patrice Lumumba and Aban Ramdan. Lumumba, I'm sure most of you know of, but and in my book I write about his relationship with Lumumba, which was more ambiguous than I think people have understood. They were close, but one could make the argument that on some level Fanon sold out Lumumba during Lumumba's crisis. And Aban Ramdan was the architect of Algeria, the Algerian struggle inside Algeria, a very brilliant and committed leader who was murdered by his own comrades in Morocco in late 1957. And Fanon knew this, but 6 months later, Fanon at El Mujahid, the paper that he co-edited, was involved in a decision to publish an article announcing Aban Ramdan's death, which claimed that he had died on the battlefield of honor, which was anything but the case. He was in a, he was in a very, it'd be very easy to attack him for this, and I don't, because he was in a very difficult bind. In the case of Aban Ramdan, if he had gone against those who had killed him, he himself might have been killed. He really didn't have anywhere to go. He couldn't go to France. He couldn't go to
That's a problem.
He couldn't go to Martinique. I mean,
Yeah.
Martinique was a part of France. It had become a department. If he had gone back to the countries that he would most logically have returned to, he would have been arrested or worse. You know, he could have faced very serious consequences. So he didn't really have many places to go. And I don't think he could have just stepped down from the FLN apparatus and said, I'm just going to work as a doctor here. So his options were few. And in the case of Lumumba, he had gone to Kinshasa to represent the GPRA, the provisional Algerian government in exile, and his role was not to defend Lumumba. So he had made a decision to go, in a sense, from being the rebel that he had been to being a revolutionary bureaucrat, and there was a price to pay. And what's, I think, remarkable about the Wretched of the Earth is that even in this very, in what is essentially a manifesto, he includes warnings that clearly reflect the difficulty of those choices and his understanding that moving from liberation to actual freedom was not an easy or clear road, because within these revolutions there had developed bureaucracies that had their own interests, not necessarily the interests of the people they were representing.
I mean, we are sitting here in 2024, of course, we are so knowledgeable now about, looking back on Stalinism and how people stayed within the structure because it was a question of life and death, their existence in their children's and their parents' lives if they would renounce it. So, I mean, people end up defending all sorts of things for a long time.
And I think it was just belief. I think it was also belief in the revolution. He believed that the Algerian Revolution was not about any one individual. It was about a struggle against colonialism, and he had married the revolution, and there were going to be setbacks. They were regrettable. They haunted him, but ultimately he wanted to stay with the Algerian struggle.
I mean, he of course died so early that we don't know what would have happened to see it, because interesting what you also describe in the book, how quickly after the Algerian independence, what he was fighting for was achieved in a sense, sort of to be independent from France, but that immediately sort of this universalist ideas about struggle against colonialism and secular non-religious aspect that was immediately turned into a nationalist Algerian, and also where Islam started to play a role that Fanon never had a real connection to. So that's when what he didn't see anymore, right?
It's complicated because you know, it's important to recall that the FLN, you know, always understood itself to be fighting for a free Algeria based on Islamic principles, and given that France had so brutally treated the Algerian majority, which was Berber and Arab and practiced Islam, an assertion of Algeria's Islamic identity was inevitable. There was no way that the Algerian movement was going to embrace some non-identitarian version of, like, you know, the French Republican Prince. That was not going to happen. It was important culturally to assert Algeria's Islamic heritage. I think Fanon was aware of that, but I don't think he really understood how significant, how crucial that was to the self-definition of the FLN. He was close to a current within the FLN that was leftist, that was reasonably secular, that was largely, although not exclusively, composed of Berbers who had been influenced by Marxism, and that was a genuine current within the FLN, and it continued to exist after the revolution because the FLN was a front. I mean, it was not a political party, and so all the different tendencies within the FLN would go on to exist within an independent Algeria, and were represented in a variety of political parties, and so. I want to honor the existence of that current and not suggest that it was somehow merely an illusion on Fanon's part or on the part of those who embraced it. But the fact is, a very different current was much stronger. It was Islamo-populist. It was very close. It was very close to the intelligence services. The most important figures in Tunis at the time that Fanon lived there were the Colonel Houari Boumediene and the intelligence chief, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on his, on his name right now. But he was the head of the MAL, the intelligence services, and these were the key figures. They were shaping the vision of the Algerian state to come, which was a security state founded on the celebration of the peasantry and on a fairly conservative definition of Islam. By no means an Islamic state, but a state deeply impregnated with religion.
I mean, a lot of his contemporary fighters, friends, intellectuals also left after some of the years and went back somewhere to Europe where it was probably easier for them.
Many of them did. Yeah, absolutely. The person I was thinking of was Abdelhafid Boussouf. Now, interestingly, one of the people who took part in the assassination of Aban Ramdan was the head of the Foreign Affairs Bureau of the FLN, Krim Belkacem, a very important figure whom Fanon once treated when he was suffering a terrible illness. And Krim Belkacem went into exile not long after the revolution, after independence, and in 1970 he was found strangled in a hotel room in Frankfurt.
Now, go figure. It's like a little bit like Putin's FSB agents who will always come and find you even after years and years. But so, of course, he died very early, and he has been, as we said before, revisited and resurrected in his thinking with the Black Lives Matter and all the struggles for against injustice. And in 2024, of course, we are now seeing a whole generation of young people on American English universities in Vienna, but sort of a general feeling that there's a new generation fighting a new fight against the injustice in Gaza at the moment. Where do you think he would have stood there? Because, of course, the young people who go on the streets or go make pro-Palestinian encampments are totally non-violent. But they also, there's an undercurrent that suggests always that the October 7th, sort of the massacre on the Israeli civilians, sort of is not always totally sort of excluded from these slogans, from things. So there's the big question hanging over these encampments and the whole struggle against this injustice of the war that Israel conducts in Gaza against the civilians, the Palestinians, and the Hamas leadership. That there is something of a violent struggle also being romanticized. So if you look at Frantz Fanon in this perspective, is there something where you would think you would wish he would now come out and say, like, guys, we don't want Hamas type of violence? What would he say? What would he do?
Now you're reminding me of that classic scene in Annie Hall where
the mother speaks.
No, it's this. No, it's no. That's another one. But the scene in Annie Hall where Woody Allen's character is standing in line at I think for a screening at the Museum of Modern Art, and he's going crazy because there's this guy behind him, this city college professor, who is rambling. He was trying to impress this woman he's with his insights into the work of Marshall McLuhan, and he's using lots of newfangled jargon, and Alvy Singer, Woody Allen's character, is going crazy. And he finds Marshall McLuhan. Marshall McLuhan just appears out of nowhere and says, "You know nothing about my work." Anyway, it's a great scene. But
so we
I'm not going to do that actually. And I've written a biography of Frantz Fanon. Obviously I've read the work and thought a lot about it. And one of my arguments about the work is that it's contradictory. It's an open text. It lends itself to many readings. It lends itself, like most great works of political reflection, to creative misreadings as well. I mean, what would Marx have said about the Stalinist dictatorships? I mean, from one point of view,
I was always interested.
From one point of view, I think he would have been horrified. I mean, because Marx obviously, very much embraced a vision of human freedom, and from another point of view, these states reflected a provisional stage before the withering away of the state. I mean, I don't think we know what Fanon would have said. I mean, I got into a bit of I should probably draw a deep breath here before I say anything, because this is a question I've had to answer before, but it's a question that inevitably gets into trouble, and I got into a bit of trouble myself after a few weeks after October 7, when I published a piece in the London Review of Books suggesting that Fanon's views on violence were rather more complicated than suggested by some of the latter-day Fanonians who regarded October 7 as an act of classical Fanonian rebellion. And my purpose in writing this was not certainly to tell Palestinians this is how you should rebel. I mean, I'm certainly not in a position to tell anyone, and that's not my choice. But the idea that this expressed a Fanonian, the idea that this is something that Fanon would necessarily have embraced didn't really persuade me. I mean, I don't want to speculate too much. I mean, I do think that, to me, Fanon is more interesting here as an analyst and as a psychiatric thinker than he is as advocate or as critic. I don't think that we can invoke Fanon to say he would approve or he would disapprove. I think Fanon would not have had trouble understanding why an occupied people who had been subjected to extreme levels of violence and suffering, particularly over the last 16 or 17 years during the blockade of Gaza, an Israeli blockade enforced by the Egyptians as well, I don't think he would have had trouble understanding why such a people would resort to violent means to end their suffering and to make their suffering known. I think he also would have understood the political context in which Al-Aqsa flood, Hamas's operation, took place. This was a moment when the Palestinian struggle for self-determination, independence, freedom was at risk of being forgotten by the world, thanks to the Abraham Accords, thanks to the impending normalization of relations between Israel and various Arab regimes, thanks to the fact that in large part, certainly in the West Bank, Palestinian resistance to the Israeli occupation had been contained, if not neutralized. Israel was very happy. And I think we have to remember that in that situation of what to the Israelis felt like peace, right? No suicide bombings, very few attacks, prosperity. The Israelis were not moved to do anything. They were not moved to end the occupation. They were not moved to end discrimination and injustice against Palestinian citizens of Israel. They were not moved to call into question the various racist laws that had been imposed under the Netanyahu government. None of these things happened.
Yeah. But I mean,
so the Palestinians were very much at an impasse. And Hamas also wanted to affirm its primacy within that struggle, essentially to take over the Palestinian struggle. Now, in that piece that I mentioned, I draw some parallels between Al-Aqsa flood and the Philippeville uprising of 1955 in Algeria, which took place under similar conditions. The FLN was not doing well in its struggle against the French. There were other Algerian groups that were emerging at the time. They were at an impasse, and it was at that very moment that two commanders of the FLN organized an uprising in Philippeville in eastern Algeria, in which peasants were given weapons, and they descended into these towns and massacred dozens of French people and also some Algerian Muslims as well. And the French responded by killing about 12,000 Algerians. And that really was the point of no return in the Algerian struggle for independence. And I think that Fanon would have seen some of the parallels between Al-Aqsa and Philippeville. I think also it's fair to assume that Fanon would have understood the jubilation experienced by some Palestinians at the spectacle of an armed group, that uses, even before we get to the murdering, that uses its ingenuity, its clandestinity, to outsmart their oppressors and to carry out a surprise attack. First of all, aimed at the military fortresses and at the soldiers who were guarding them. I think any oppressed group would. But then, of course, we have to deal with the entirety of what Al-Aqsa flood actually meant. And it was not simply an attack on penetrating these fortresses. It was not simply the killing of Israeli soldiers. It was also what appears to have been a systematic attempt to kill civilians. And although the Israelis have hardly covered themselves in glory by inventing a lot of stories, I mean, there are certain stories that we know to be untrue now. There were no beheaded babies.
No, but that's not, I mean...
but yes. Hold on. I'm just saying, there was a fair amount of propaganda unleashed afterward that had to do with the the degree to which rape was systematic. There were stories told by the Israelis, unfortunately, but they didn't. The
tragedy of October 7th is that it was such a violent massacre.
It was a horrifying massacre.
That sort of also the traumatization of everyone who was only remotely involved, including sort of the stories that were true or not true. It was true enough.
The reason I mention this is that unfortunately, the propaganda about some of these things that did not occur fueled a wave of denialism among Palestinians that anything had happened. In other words, it has become, I think, unfortunately, quite common for Palestinians to imagine that Israeli civilians were not killed, or that they were killed by Israeli soldiers, not by Palestinians. In fact, there was a vast massacre of civilians. About 700 Israeli civilians, as well as foreign workers and Bedouins and Palestinian Israelis, were killed on that day. And
plus a lot of soldiers that were sort of not in the position to actually fight.
Exactly.
So all this, I mean, I think there's no question about the monstrosity of October 7th in its effect on the civilians that sort of got killed. The tragedy of all armed struggle, of course, is that this comes with it, but also what in that particular incident, as you set up the stage for it, that there was so much in the context that led to this, and that Hamas actually was successful in this attack because it brought the Palestinian struggle back, and also the injustice they are living under to the world's attention, which of course now makes Hamas more popular than they should be, since they had also
it's unclear. They're very popular in the West Bank, but I think they're less and less popular in Gaza for fairly obvious. It's very hard to tell. I mean, it's very hard to know how much support they actually have in Gaza, and I mean, it's not as though surveys can be conducted in any reliable fashion in Gaza.
But still, the tragedy is that Hamas, of course, got the attention by killing all these people, but also had no plan what to do with it. And so at the moment, Israel and Hamas are going at it against each other, and we are all sitting there, and nobody really has a plan how to get out of this.
Well, I think potentially, I mean, I can't read the mind of Yahya Sinwar, the architect of Al-Aqsa flood, but who's currently probably hiding in one of these tunnels. But he probably thinks that by killing all these Palestinians and by essentially eliminating the very conditions of life in Gaza, Israel is killing itself. And he's not entirely wrong about that, by the way. I mean,
that's one of the other tragedies of this conflict.
No, I can't be there. There are people. I mean, I say this not because I believe it. I don't believe it. But unfortunately, there are people who believe that this operation was a historic success, and it's a very, very troubling thought.
On the destruction of most of Gaza. So let's bring in maybe
to go back to
our auditor.
But you did make one point that I failed to answer, and it has to do with the students and the students who are protesting on behalf of Gaza. And I would agree with you. On the one hand, I'm encouraged by the fact that there is a mass movement of students in the United States on American campuses who are horrified by what's happening in Gaza, who want to put an end to it, who are calling for things like divestment. I never in my lifetime thought that I would see a mass movement in support of Palestinian rights in the States. And I think that's a pretty extraordinary development. And on the whole, I'm supportive of it. What I do find disquieting is that, and it's hard to say how deeply this runs, but there is certainly a faction, whether it's a fringe or not, I can't say, of the students who, for whom any kind of resistance is both legitimate and to be supported and praised. And it's true, some of them do invoke Fanon. I think they invoke him in a rather glib and superficial manner, but there you go. They will invoke people like Fanon, or they'll invoke Edward Said, while ignoring the fact that Said was actually critical, not of armed struggle tout court, but of certain uses of armed struggle. And this glorification of violence, this belief that somehow the carnage of an October 7 will lead to the promised land, this willingness to look past not just the massacre, but the aspects of Hamas itself, which I think should give pause to anyone who sees themselves as a part of a humane left. That worries me. And I suspect that this moment will pass, that people will be forced to reckon with just how complex the situation is. It's my hope. But I've certainly been troubled by some of the language that I've heard in the protests. On the other hand, I think it's very encouraging that a great number of Jewish students have also participated in them, and that at Columbia, there was even a Seder. There was a Seder of left-wing Jewish students, and this is something you do not read about in the press. There's this.
No, we did hear that.
You heard, but I think often the implication is that these are anti-Semitic demonstrations. They're hostile to Jews, and I think that's not true.
But is sort of having talked about it now for an hour, and we want to bring it now also to you, please. So please think what you want to ask also. To bring it together is the question that Fanon argued for an armed struggle. That you bring in Edward Said here also at the end, who was one of the big thinkers also of how to deal with a context that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict presented himself to, was the idea to have a negotiated solution which would be preferable to violence. So the violence of Frantz Fanon or other sort of revolutionary movements was not necessarily because for the violence itself, but to lead to a constructive sort of settlement, and that is sort of the point of it all, isn't it?
Let's remember. I mean, I think one of the unfortunate aspects of the iconization, the reverential treatment of Fanon, who was a brilliant thinker but also a flawed thinker, is that those who are invoking Fanon in the case of Algeria, one, have really read nothing about Algeria. They don't know about the history of Algeria's struggle. And Algeria's struggle was won not just through armed struggle. The FLN was destroyed militarily by the end of the war. It was won through civil disobedience by Algerians who were protesting peacefully in the streets of Algiers in 1960 when Charles de Gaulle came, and he realized, oh, actually, people want independence. It was won through the creative diplomacy of Algerians' great diplomats at the UN. It was not won principally through violence. Fanon was wrong about that. Violence was a stage. It was important. It was symbolically important. There needed to be a rupture with France. But the idea that violence, had led to Algeria's freedom, it's simply not true. It was a part of a struggle that included many other components. So
maybe that's the message we can send to the Hamas leadership hiding in the tunnels and some of the Israeli ministers sitting in a government which is flattening the civilians.
That a negotiated settlement would be preferable, but what we've seen, of course, over the past 30 years has been the utter failure of negotiations and Israel's success in using protracted negotiations to continue colonizing the West Bank, to create facts on the ground, and to essentially impose what the great Israeli sociologist Baruch Kimmerling called politicide, which is the denial of any political recognition to the Palestinian people. There was bound to be an explosion. Yeah. I mean, what happened on October 7th is a horror. But when you think about the events of the last 30 years and the crushing of Palestinian aspirations, it's not surprising that something of this order took place.
But what you are saying in an essay that you wrote, also Israel's Descent, in the London Review of Books, was, which I think picked up a lot of the sentiment that is happening now on the streets in Europe in these demonstrations, that Israel has lost the moral war among people of conscience because of the build-up of this, the sort of unjust structures within Israel and the occupied territories for Palestinians. And for the longest time, people have not reacted to this very much. Not the European governments, also not. And so now I think it's a point where all this comes together in all this violence that erupts now, where people are polarized and it's terrible and the suffering is just absolutely incredible on both sides. But what happens is that Israel is not simply seen anymore as a moral state per se, but is really struggling now to also define what it actually wants to be as a state.
I think those who who have followed this history closely, over the years, who have a knowledge of Israel's position in the region, of Israeli policy from its very origins, understand that it never was. It never was this moral actor. But at various moments, I think there's been a greater popular awareness. Certainly, the 1982 invasion of Lebanon led to to great soul searching on the part of people who had thought of Israel as a moral actor. I think that when I say that my point isn't that Israel had this great moral capital which it's gone on to squander. My point rather is that there's been a sea change in the attitudes of young people with respect to Israel. Israel is no longer seen as this the sole democracy in the Middle East or as the sanctuary of a people who had been brutally persecuted in Europe. That is not the perception of young people anymore.
I think that a lot of people would disagree also with you, maybe also here. So let's see what you would like to discuss, please.